The text came in while they were prepping me for a CT scan, and I remember thinking the phone screen was the brightest thing in the room. Brighter than the fluorescent lights, brighter than the little pen light the resident kept shining in my eyes. It said, "Can't this wait? We're in the middle of closing on the Belmont property. Call the office tomorrow." My father had typed it the way he typed everything. No punctuation wasted. No wasted warmth either. I was lying on a gurney at St. Audrey Medical Center at 4 a.m. with a seatbelt bruise blooming across my chest and a head injury they hadn't fully mapped yet, and my own father was telling me to check in with his receptionist. My name is Josie. I was 29 that winter, and up until that night I still believed, somewhere deep and stubborn, that if things ever got bad enough, my parents would show up. Not warmly, not gladly, but they'd show up. That belief is a hard thing to let go of. If you've ever kept a chair pulled out for someone who was never going to sit in it, you know exactly what I mean. Stay with me, because this is the story of the night that chair got folded up for good. Let me back up to the crash, because the crash is almost the least of it. I'd been driving home from a late shift. I'm a pediatric occupational therapist. I work with little kids who have trouble with the everyday motor stuff, buttoning a coat, holding a crayon, climbing stairs. It's the kind of job that doesn't make anybody rich and doesn't impress anybody at a dinner party, and I loved it more than I've ever loved anything I've been paid to do. That night I'd stayed 2 hours past the end of my shift to finish notes, and I was maybe 6 minutes from my building when a pickup ran the light at Grover and 9th. I didn't even see it. 1 second I was thinking about whether I had oat milk left, and the next I was upside down against my own airbag with the taste of pennies in my mouth. I was awake at first. That's important, and I'll come back to why. I was awake enough to talk to the paramedics, awake enough to answer when they asked my name and the date and who they could call. Awake enough to give them my parents' number, because whose number do you give at 4 a.m? You give the number you've been giving your whole life. But by the time I got to the ER, things had turned. The scan found bleeding on the brain, a subdural hematoma, they'd tell me later, and it was growing. My words started slurring. My right hand stopped doing what I told it. The last clear thing I remember is a nurse named Camille leaning very close to my face and saying, "Josie, honey, stay with me. We're going to take good care of you," and then a long stretch of nothing at all. Here's the part that matters, the part I've had to explain to a lot of people since. Because I couldn't consent to the surgery myself, and because there was a signed durable power of attorney sitting in a folder somewhere with my parents' names on it, the hospital had a legal obligation to reach my healthcare proxy before they put a probe into my skull. That POA existed because 2 years earlier my father had sat me down in his glass-walled office and slid a stack of documents across his enormous desk and said, in the warm oil voice he used on clients, "This is just smart estate planning, kiddo. We'll get everybody organized while we're all healthy, so nobody has to make hard calls in a crisis." I signed where the little flags told me to. I thought, God help me, I thought it meant he cared. So while a surgeon stood scrubbed in waiting, a social worker named Marisol sat in a corner of the ER dialing my parents over and over and over. My mother's phone went to voicemail, my father's went to voicemail, and then, an hour into the worst night of my life, the answer came. Not a call, a text. "Can't this wait? We're in the middle of closing on the Belmont property." I didn't read it until 3 days later, when Marisol handed me my phone in the recovery unit, and I scrolled up through my own frantic, half-legible messages and found his reply sitting there like a stone. But I'm telling you about it now because it's the spine of everything that came after. When Marisol showed the surgeon that the proxy was refusing to engage, the hospital did the only thing they could. The surgeon documented it as an emergency and operated under implied consent to save my life. But she also asked Marisol a question that would change my whole future. Is there anyone else, any other family? I'd given the paramedics exactly one backup number, scrawled in a contact I almost never used. My aunt, my father's older sister, Aunt Faye. My parents didn't talk about Aunt Faye much. When they did, it was with a particular thinning of the lips, like they'd bitten into something past its date. She was, in my father's telling, difficult. She'd made her choices. She lived an hour outside the city in a little house with a garden that had, quote, taken over the yard like it was trying to prove something. What I knew of her from actual life was thinner than what I knew from those comments, because my parents had spent my childhood keeping us apart. But I knew she'd been an ICU nurse for 31 years. I knew she sent a birthday card every single year with a real handwritten note, not just a signature. And I knew from one summer when I was 9 and my parents dumped me at her place for 2 weeks while they went to a conference in Scottsdale, that her house smelled like tomatoes and warm bread, and that she'd taught me how to pinch the suckers off a plant and let a jar seal with that little satisfying pop. Marisol called her at 4:40 in the morning. Aunt Faye later told me she was dressed and in her car before she'd fully hung up the phone. She drove the whole hour with her high beams on, 68 years old, and she walked into that ER at 6:15 still wearing her gardening fleece with dried dirt ground into the knees, because she'd been out checking her cold frames when the call came and hadn't thought to change. She found Marisol first, got the full picture from her in about 90 seconds, nurse to social worker, the shorthand of people who both speak crisis fluently, and then she came and found me in recovery. I don't remember it, I was still under. But she told me she stood by the bed and put her hand around my good hand and said my name, and then she pulled the chair close and sat down and she didn't leave. When I finally surfaced, hours later the world came back in pieces. A ceiling tile with a water stain shaped like Ohio, a monitor beeping somewhere behind me, and then a face I half recognized from a decade of birthday cards, silver hair coming loose from a clip, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a paperback folded open against her knee. She saw my eyes track to her and she leaned in so fast the book slid to the floor. "There she is," she said. Her voice cracked right down the middle. "Hi, sweetheart, you're okay. You made it. I'm right here." I tried to say something and it came out as nothing. "Just air. Don't talk. Don't you dare try to talk." She was crying and laughing at the same time, and she pressed her lips to my forehead the way you'd press a stamp onto a letter you really wanted to arrive. "I'm not going anywhere. You hear me? I'll be right here when you're ready." I want to tell you I cried tears of gratitude. What actually happened was stranger and more honest. My first coherent thought floating up out of the anesthesia was, where are Mom and Dad? Because that's how deep it went, even then, even with the stranger aunt weeping over me, because she loved me enough to drive an hour through the dark. Some broken part of my brain was still scanning the room for the two people who couldn't be bothered. That thought is going to matter later. Hold on to it. My parents made their appearance 4 days after the surgery. By then I was upright in bed, my head shaved on one side and stapled shut, my right arm still not fully cooperating. Aunt Faye had gone home to shower and feed her chickens for the first time in 96 hours, so I was alone when the door opened and my mother came in holding a small paper bag and my father came in holding his phone. "Well," my mother said, doing that thing where her eyes go everywhere in a room except your face. "You look better than I expected." She set the bag on the rolling table. It was a bag of the caramels they sell by the register at the gas station off the interstate, the ones that stick your molars together. The visitor parking here is highway robbery. $18. My father was over by the window, holding his phone up toward the light like the reception was better near the glass. "This is a nightmare of a hospital to get to," he said to the window, not to me. "We circled the deck twice. They stayed 35 minutes. I know because I watched the clock behind their heads. In that half hour, my mother told me about a buyer who'd backed out of a listing and how stressful it had all been, and my father took 2 calls in the hallway and neither of them asked me if it hurt. Not once. What my father did ask, buttoning his coat to leave, was, "So what's the timeline here? When do they think you'll be back on your feet? You've got that little job, they must need you back. That little job. When do you go back? Not how are you? Not we were so scared. Not I'm sorry about the text, Josie, I didn't understand how bad it was. Just, when can you be useful again?" They left to make a reservation. My mother reminded me to eat the caramels. And when the door clicked shut behind them, the quiet they left was so total and so cold that I understood, finally, in my body and not just my head, that I had spent my entire life auditioning for a part that had never actually been open. The discharge conversation came a couple of days later. A resident with kind eyes explained that with my head, my shoulder, and my balance, I couldn't be alone and I absolutely couldn't do stairs for a good while. My condo was on the 3rd floor of a building with a temperamental elevator. Panic came up my throat like water. And before I could even start to spiral about where I would possibly go, that voice came from the chair in the corner where she'd reinstalled herself the second she got back. "She's coming to my place." Aunt Faye said it to the resident like it was already decided, because to her it already was. One story. "I've got a spare room on the main floor and a downstairs bath. I raised 3 foster kids and buried a husband in that house. I know how to take care of somebody." She looked at me then softer. "If she'll have me. If I'll have her." Moving into Aunt Faye's house was like the first breath after you've been holding it too long underwater. Her spare room had a quilt on the bed she'd stitched herself. A wedding ring pattern in blues and yellows. She cooked. Lord, she cooked. Soups and pot roasts and cornbread, and she'd sit with me for the whole long ugly hour of my home exercises, counting my reps out loud, telling me stories about patients she'd nursed back from worse than me. When I couldn't sleep, she'd make chamomile tea and we'd sit at her kitchen table under the one warm lamp, and she'd let me be quiet if I needed to be quiet. But it was in those sleepless dead-of-night hours that the shameful thing kept surfacing. I'd lie in her guest bed, safe and warm and loved, and I'd pick up my phone and check it. Hoping for a text from the 2 people who hadn't asked if it hurt. Why did that 35-minute visit, as insulting as it was, still sit in me like a thing I'd wanted? Why did I keep reaching for the hand that had never once reached back? I actually knew the name for it because I'd taken a psych course in grad school and it had stuck with me. Learned helplessness. It's what happens to an animal, or a person, who's been in an inescapable bad situation for so long that even when the door swings open, they stop trying to walk through it. They've been trained to expect nothing, so they take the nothing and call it normal. A kid who only ever gets a scrap of warmth learns to treat that scrap like a banquet. My parents had spent 29 years teaching me that their coldness was the weather, and I was the one who needed a thicker coat. I wasn't weak, I'd been conditioned. And lying there in a house that finally felt like the opposite of cold, I felt the conditioning start for the first time to loosen its grip. I thought that was the whole story, a sad, familiar story about a family that couldn't love right. I had no idea I was about to find out it was something far worse. It started with the mail. My downstairs neighbor at the condo, a retired school teacher named Rosa, had been collecting my mail out of pure decency, and after a few weeks she drove it all out to Aunt Faye's in a banker's box that she could barely lift. "I didn't want to bother you," she said, hugging me carefully around the staples in my head, but it just kept coming and coming. I sat at Aunt Faye's kitchen table and started sorting. Medical bills, obviously, a whole terrifying stratum of them. Insurance explanations of benefits, the usual junk. But then I hit an envelope from my long-term disability carrier, the coverage I had through my employer, and the letter inside didn't make any sense. It referenced a conversation about my claim. A conversation I had never had, I called them. I sat on hold for 22 minutes with a little head injury throbbing behind my eye, and finally a representative picked up and I explained who I was and that I was trying to understand my own claim. There was a pause, the kind of pause that makes your stomach drop before your brain has caught up. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm showing that we've already been coordinating with the parties named on your durable power of attorney. Let me see, your financial proxies, they reached out." Another pause, worse than the first. "It looks like about 3 days after your accident. They were asking about the process for surrendering the policy and having the benefit paid out as a lump sum." Surrendering, not filing my claim so I could pay my rent while I couldn't work. Surrendering the policy. Cashing it out. I felt the blood leave my face. I thanked the man in a voice I didn't recognize, hung up, and dialed my father. He answered on the second ring, breezy as anything. "Josie, we were wondering when we'd hear from you. How's the head? Why did you try to cash out my disability policy?" The silence stretched. I could hear him deciding which voice to use. He landed on the patient, condescending one, the one for clients who don't understand markets. "Now, hang on, your mother and I are your proxies. That's our job, to manage things when you can't." The way that policy was structured, it made more sense to take the lump sum and reposition it. "We were protecting you." "Reposition it where, Dad?" "It's just a restructuring, where?" And here's where the mask slipped, just for a second, and I heard what was actually under it. "Look, the firm has a temporary cash flow situation, all right? The Belmont deal went sideways. It's a bridge. You'd have gotten every cent back the moment we closed the next one. There's no need to be dramatic about it. A bridge. He was going to use the money I needed to survive, the money meant to feed me while my brain healed, to plug a hole in his sinking business, and he genuinely convinced himself that made him the responsible one." I hung up on him. My hands were shaking, but not the way they'd shaken in the ER. This was a cold, clean, focused shaking. And I went back to the box, because now I was looking. Now I understood the box wasn't just bills, it was evidence. Near the bottom I found an envelope from a bank I'd never held an account with. Inside was a denial letter, an application declined. But it wasn't for a credit card. It was for a home equity line of credit, against my condo. The condo my father had co-signed the mortgage on 2 years earlier, because I hadn't had the credit history to get it a loan, and he'd insisted, "It's just a formality, Josie, it just gets you in the door." He'd used that formality, that co-signature, that access, to apply to borrow against the equity in my home. The application date was on the letter. It was dated 2 days after my accident, while I was in the ICU. While a machine was breathing for me and a stranger aunt was praying over my bed, my father was at a desk, filling out paperwork to hollow out my home and pour it into his failing company. Everything I'd been feeling, the grief, the learned helplessness, the sad ache for parents who couldn't love me, it didn't melt. It hardened, because I finally understood what I was looking at. This wasn't neglect. Neglect is passive. This was active. This was somebody circling while I was unconscious, waiting for me to be too weak to notice so he could strip me for parts. This wasn't a cold family. This was a predator who happened to have my last name. I didn't cry. I set the letter down flat on the table and I looked up, and Aunt Faye was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder, watching my face. She'd seen a lot of faces in 31 years of nursing. She knew this one meant something bad. I couldn't get the words out, so I just slid the letter across the table to her. She read it. I watched her jaw set. She read it twice. Then she went very quiet, put the towel down, and walked out of the room. She came back holding an old address book, the spiral kind, the cover soft as cloth from decades of handling. She turned to a page near the back, ran her finger down a column of names, and picked up the landline on the wall. She still had a landline and dialed a number she clearly knew by heart. Marcus, she said. Wait, I'll get his name right because I'll owe it to him for the rest of my life. It's Faye from Northridge. Yes, it's been too long. Listen, I'm not calling for a chat, honey. I'm calling because my niece is in a very bad way, and I think it's the kind of thing that's up your alley. She listened a moment, glanced at me, and held the phone out. He's an attorney, elder law and financial abuse mostly. He'll talk to you right now. I took the phone. I told him everything, the crash, the text, the 35-minute visit, the disability policy, the HELOC application dated while I was in the ICU. I told it in a flat, steady voice that didn't sound like me. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished there was a short silence on the line. Josie, he said, I want to be very careful with my words, so hear me clearly. What you're describing isn't a family disagreement. Using a power of attorney to act against the interests of the person who granted it, attempting to liquidate her assets and encumber her property while she's incapacitated, that's a breach of fiduciary duty. Depending on what they actually completed, it edges into financial exploitation, which in this state is a crime. The good news is that a POA can be revoked by the principal at any time, as long as she's competent. And you are competent. So here's what we're going to do. I could hear him writing. I'm going to draft a full revocation of the durable power of attorney, medical and financial both. I'm going to send formal notice to your parents and to every institution that has a copy on file so no one can act on their word again. I'm going to prepare cease and desist letters, and we're going to execute new documents naming a proxy you actually trust. Who would that be? I looked at my aunt, standing at the counter with her arms crossed and her chin high, still in her gardening fleece with the dirt on the knees, the only person in my entire bloodline who had ever once driven through the dark for me. My aunt, I said. Faye. She didn't move, but her eyes went bright. Good, Marcus said. I'll have everything ready in 48 hours. In the meantime, you rest, and you don't sign one single thing they put in front of you, understand? When I hung up, the betrayal still sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. But underneath it, for the first time in my whole life, I felt something new. It took me a second to name it. It was power. This wasn't a sad family story anymore. It was a fight, a real one, with rules and paper and a man on my side who knew where the lines were, and I was ready to have it. 4 weeks to the day after the crash, I called my parents and asked them to come to Aunt Faye's house. I was off the heavy painkillers by then. My head was clear. My balance had come back enough that I could stand at the door on my own when they arrived. They came in annoyed. My father first, checking his watch, not looking at me. Josie, this is extremely inconvenient. We've got a walkthrough at 3. Whatever this is, can we make it quick? Then he stopped, because he'd seen the living room. I was sitting in Aunt Faye's big armchair with my bad leg up on the ottoman. On one side of me sat my aunt, hands folded calmly in her lap, calm as a lake. On the other side sat Marcus in a charcoal suit with a leather portfolio open across his knee. My mother's professional smile died on her face. What is this? Who is he? Please sit down, I said. My voice came out level and even, and I heard it and thought, look at that. They lowered themselves onto the sofa across from me. On the coffee table between us was a plain manila envelope. I picked it up and slid it toward them. My father actually rolled his eyes. What now? More bills? These, I said, holding his gaze, are a complete revocation of every power of attorney you hold over me, medical and financial. They're cease and desist notices, and they remove you both as proxies and as beneficiaries on every account and policy I have, effective as of the moment they were filed, which was yesterday. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Josie, no! How could you do this after everything we've done? My father's face went blotchy and red, the color climbing up out of his collar. The smooth financial advisor mask came off all at once. Ungrateful, he said, standing up. This is how you repay us? We were trying to protect your assets, protect them, I repeated, and I let the word hang in the room until it curdled. The way you protected them when you applied for a home equity loan on my condo 2 days after my accident, while I was still on a ventilator. The room went dead silent. My mother stopped mid-word. Marcus didn't move. Aunt Faye didn't move. And my father's face drained from red to a terrible chalky white as he realized in real time that the one thing he'd been counting on, my weakness, my ignorance, my lifelong habit of never pushing back, was gone. He sat down hard, like his legs had quit. He'd been so certain of his own cleverness that it had never once occurred to him he might be caught by his invisible daughter. You don't understand the pressure we've been under, my mother whispered, and her voice was actually shaking now. The firm? I understand it fine, I said, and I didn't yell, which somehow made it land harder. I understand it better than you think. But your failing company stopped being my problem the second you decided my recovery money was yours to spend. I nodded at the envelope. Sign the papers. I want to tell you a thing I've learned, because I think a lot of you watching this need to hear it. We sit there and watch people treat us like this, and we feel guilty. We've been raised on the idea that blood is thicker than water, that family is forever, that you owe them no matter what. But that phrase is a leash, and toxic people are the ones holding it. They count on your guilt. They count on the fact that you'll keep setting yourself on fire just to keep them a little bit warm. And letting go of a blood tie that's bleeding you dry isn't a betrayal. It's the most basic form of self-preservation there is. It's the moment you stop being the supporting character in their story and start being the lead in your own. My father took a pen out of his jacket. His hand was shaking with a rage he had no right to feel, and he scrawled his signature across the pages, pressing so hard the pen nearly tore the paper. My mother signed after him, and I watched a tear fall and blur the ink on her line. Then they stood up and they left, and neither of them said a single word, and my father did not look back once. The door closed, and the silence Aunt Faye's little house settled into after that was not the cold silence of the hospital room. It was clean. It was mine. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since I was about 6 years old. The weeks after that were about rebuilding, and not just the shoulder and the shaved side of my head. With Marcus's help, I locked everything down. New bank, new brokerage, fraud alerts on my credit, a whole new set of proxies and directives with Aunt Faye's name where my father's used to be, and a limited list, spelled out in plain English, of exactly who could do exactly what on my behalf and nothing more. Marcus told me the disability surrender had been caught before it went through and the HELOC had been denied on its own. Thank God, but he documented all of it anyway. You never know, he said, when you'll want a record. I paid him what I could and he waved off half of it and told me to buy Faye something nice with the difference. I sold the condo. I couldn't stomach living in a place my father had looked at and seen only equity to strip. I found a little ground floor apartment across town, 1 bedroom, wide doorways, a slab of concrete out back that the listing generously called a patio. Aunt Faye came the first weekend with a truck full of tomato starts and a bag of soil, and she built me 3 raised garden beds out of cedar boards, measuring and cutting and swearing cheerfully the whole afternoon. Just till you get your strength back, she said, tamping down the last bed. But she built them to last 30 years, and we both knew it. I went back to work, to my little job that doesn't pay and doesn't impress anyone. But I wasn't the same therapist who'd left. I'd learned things in that banker's box I never wanted to know, how a power of attorney can be turned into a weapon, how an unconscious patient is a target, how nobody warns you about any of it until you're the one bleeding. So I took all of it to my director and I pitched something new, a small program to pair patients recovering from major medical events with free legal and financial advocacy, so that no one lying in an ICU ever again wakes up to find their own family has been treating them like an estate sale. She said yes. We ran the first workshop in the spring. 11 people came, one of them cried and thanked me, and I had to go stand in the hallway for a minute. Last night I hosted a dinner in my little apartment. Aunt Faye was there, of course, teaching Camille, the ER nurse who'd said stay with me and who it turned out lived 4 blocks away and had checked on me twice, how to cheat at gin rummy. Rosa brought a pie. Marcus stopped by for exactly 1 slice and swore me to secrecy about the fact that he'd come. We ate off mismatched plates around a table too small for all of us, and the food was in bowls, and the tomatoes in the salad had come out of my own 3 cedar beds, grown with my own hands, the way a woman in a dirty gardening fleece had taught me 20 years ago, and again, patiently this year. And I looked around that table, at the people who had shown up, none of whom I was born to, and I understood I was whole in a way I had never once been in my parents' magazine cover condo. So if you're out there and you've spent your life feeling like the extra in your own family, the one who's tolerated but never really seen, I need you to hear one thing before you go. You are not defined by the love you didn't get. Your worth was never theirs to measure. Family isn't the people who share your blood, it's the people who show up, who listen, who sit in the dark with you, and then, when you're ready, kneel down in the dirt and build you something that lasts. Don't be afraid to let go of what's draining you. The real ones, the ones who are meant to catch you, they're already on their way, and some of them are already at the table.